On the orbital station Aurora 7, Captain Nathaniel Cross has the gravity technology that manipulates the same solar flares to which those underground humans cowered, and one of the ships has saviors with gravity-based abilities. They can throw gravitational resonance generators into the so-called world killers. When a hostile Carthan fleet attacks human space, Cross uses these stellar manipulating devices to cause a deadly solar storm that annihilates the enemy fleet and make them surrender. But their victory comes with unforeseen consequences. It clears the way for the developing of new technologies. If others can duplicate the results, so can we. And in the wrong hands, those results can be very, very bad news. A few decades after the first messages are discovered, Marius, an army, begins working on an odd mission, creating incursions into the fabric of the universe to give humans a chance to find the enemy, because once they do find them, they will kill them. What our flesh and blood has in common with the digital mind is its predisposal to violence through the accumulation of misery. Marius seeks out the AMI with the strongest survival instinct he can find. In the post-apocalyptic society of Illuminatus, the epic follows the evolution of humans from the victims of cosmic forces to the masters of star-wielding celestial weapons and the consequences, ethical or otherwise, of waging battle in the heavens. Cross ultimately adds his expertise to the struggle to urge the development of international protocols for the safe manipulation of stars and prevent the possibility of an arms race that dwarfs Armageddon while incinerating every inhabited planet around every star. Captain Nathaniel Cross peered out the observation post of orbital station A27 Aurora 7 at the flickering Proxima Centauri, flickering in an odd, artificial pattern. The red star, which had ruled the roost for millennia, causing neighboring civilizations terror with its tempestuous solar flares, now danced to humanity's chevron, its magnetic field lines manipulated by the giant gravity resonance generators which wove in perfect alignment around its equator. Flare strength is 92% of maximum. Lieutenant Commander Victoria Hayes announced from the tactical station behind him. Her fingers tapped holographic displays, showing live magnetic field readings from the stars. Target acquisition. Confirmed Carthon battle fleet. They're not hiding very well behind Proxima B's magnetosphere yet. Cross turned from the viewing window to give him a look. The lined face of a dozen interstellar wars furrowed. He'd seen them at both extremes. Cowering subterranean from solar storms to wielding stellar acts of violence in his 53 years. It wasn't lost on him, the irony of it, that what had once caused entire planets to scramble into emergency protocol was now what mankind used as its most powerful weapon. Carthans, how long they give us before they get a clue we're up to something, he said, walking over to the main control panel, where a holographic version of a three-dimensional representation of the Proxima system slowly turned, displaying the locations of both fleets. Intelligence indicates they think these are natural events, Hayes answered, her pride of work subsumed by something like unease. Evidence shows that their defense modes are consistent with those recorded in past solar flare events. This is a natural disaster situation, not a tactical strike. Cross nodded, recalling his own disbelief when he'd first been told about Project Heliosphere 15 years before. The concept was far-fetched at the time, controlling star behavior with precisely timed gravitational wave pulses, generated by the most advanced technology ever developed by humans. The idea was that if they could create artificial gravitational anomalies at certain points around a star, they might be able to destabilize the star's magnetic field just enough to cause controlled solar flares. The first successful trial they made was on an unoccupied system, where they had found a small belt of asteroids. The solar flare that resulted had been small by stellar standards, but destructive enough to turn several million tons of rock and metal into gas. The implications had been staggering. For the first time in human history, they had a weapon that could target objects in entire star systems. "Sir, message from Admiral Morrison, Captain of the Relentless," called Outcomes Officer James Reed, his young face strained in concentration. "The Admiral would like to know if we are ready to keep the appointment scheduled." Cross still cringed at the vocabulary. Scheduled appointment was a piece of military jargon, what amounted to a weaponization of stellar calamity. But he recognized the psychological importance of the language. It was too grim, too much of a reminder of when humanity had been helplessly at the mercy of such things, if he called it what it really was, the intentional setting off of disastrous solar events. "Advise the Admiral we're all green for go," Cross responded. "Gravitational resonance generators are on standby, stellar. Magnetic field is established, and acquisition is stable. On his signal we can set off the flare." As Reed transmitted the report, Cross couldn't help but think of his days as a child living on Mars, cowering in the millennia-old underground bunkers while the solar storms raged on the surface. The emotional baggage from those early years had molded an entire human generation. They had come to fear the sky, watching solar activity the way some people watched an approaching storm. Unremitting concern for radiation, exposure, and lost communication and EMP. Interference had been a feature of human presence in space. The Carthans had adapted almost all such defense techniques. Their ships were shielded with very powerful magnetic fields, their colonies far more shielded than ours. And military thinking placed a high degree of emphasis upon quick retreat to safe areas once solar activity got too high. It made sense. Given the nature of the unpredictable act of nature, what distinguished mankind was their rejection of status quo. Other species had been forced to coexist with solar flares as a fact of life, but human scientists had devoted centuries to the study and ultimately the conquest of solar activity. The key had been discovered during the research of Dr. Sarah Chen in gravitational wave manipulation, though from theoretical work from the early 21st century. Gravity generators are showing slight inconsistencies in the resonance field, Hayes barked, and one could sense the alarm in her tone. For one generator is experiencing stress markers. Cross came to her one of the stations and studied the readings over her shoulder. The generators were huge structures, each the size of a small city and operated by controlled fusion reactors. They had been arrayed in space around Proxima Centauri over the course of 3 years, a construction project that had demanded the resources of the entire human fleet. The least error, they warned, threatened to throw the whole system out of kilter. "Can we recover with the other generators?" he asked. "Already on it," Hayes said, her fingers dancing over the controls. 3 and 5 are cranking it up to hold the field. But we are getting close to the margins of safety. The pitfalls of tinkering with stars were well known. It's all too easy to punch in the wrong equation and inadvertently create a flare so much stronger than you wanted that it burns up the life on planets and the ships that orbit them. In star systems far, far away. Worst, a catastrophic failure could potentially damage the star itself permanently, shifting the star's output for thousands of years and making whole systems uninhabitable. "Admiral Morrison orders immediate advance," Reed said. "Carthan reinforcements are en route. We have a narrow window. Cross felt the heavy weight of command draping his shoulders. He made the choice to go forward, and the repercussions would be felt across the galaxy. The Carthans had been pushing expansion for centuries, enslaving lesser races and strip mining entire worlds for material. Most of their technology was far in advance of humanity's, but they had never created anything like Project Heliosphere. "Execute the appointment," he ordered. Hayes initiated the last sequence. Her voice all of a sudden composed, even as they were doing something for which there was no putting back the genie, so to speak. Complete resonance of the gravitational field performed at its full amplitude, and the star's magnetic field implodes in 3, 2, 1, 0. The impact did not become initially apparent. The artificial gravity wells of the gravitational generators were still distorting the very warp and weft of space-time with their minute dance around Proxima Centauri. The ripples emanating from that dance rippling outward at faster than the speed of light. Nothing seemed to change for several minutes, and then, slowly, the surface of the star became more active. "The magnetic field lines are reconfiguring," Hayes added. "The density of the plasma is off the charts in the target area. Stellar wind velocity increasing." Cross studied the tactical display as the Carthan fleet continued to hang back in defensive positions behind Proxima b. Massive angular constructions intended more for intimidation than for war. Every ship had enough firepower to destroy a planet, and the combined fleet was the largest military presence the Carthans had ever gathered. "Flare eruption imminent," Hayes announced. "Estimated intensity, class X9.7, duration approximately 14 minutes. The numbers were staggering. By itself, a Class 10 solar flare was already considered very extreme in nature. The artificial phenomenon they were going to see was close to 100 times more powerful than any that had already been observed. Just the electromagnetic pulse would surely disrupt unshielded electronics throughout the entire system. "Look," Cross whispered, motioning to the tactical display. "It's beginning." The solar flare burst from the surface of Proxima Centauri, like a tongue of fire licking along space. The magnetic field lines, which had been so delicately sculpted by those gravitational generators, precisely aimed the plasma stream of death at the Carthon fleet's location. The energy let off was the equivalent of billions of simultaneous nuclear bombs concentrated into a single directed beam of destruction. "Carthon fleet is trying to dodge," hoarsely stated Hayes. "They're pulling out from behind Proxima b, heading into open space." But it was too late. The solar flare struck the Carthon fleet in just under 4 minutes at almost the speed of light. It was the EMP that struck first, knocking out their defensive shields and leading to a series of catastrophic failures in their electrical grids. The plasmastim came a split second after, its brutal energy incinerating through their armor plating and causing massive structural damage. ETA on finishing off toasters hiding in debris. 3 mics, Reed called. Confirmed kills on 7 of Carthane dreadnoughts. Triage other vessels for urgent damage. They're broadcasting surrender codes. The wind brought Cross no satisfaction, for it was a responsibility of appalling magnitude, that technology which had granted this devastating edge to mankind. They had, quite literally, weaponized stellar catastrophes, making the natural forces that once had imperiled their lives a tool of warfare. "Admiral Morrison wants a status report," Reed said. "He wants to know if it's possible to induce more flares if necessary." "Let him know that we're standing down the generators," Cross added. "We'll have to let the stellar magnetic field settle before we try altering it again. As the grav generator's star their delicate start-down procedures, Cross thought about the significance what they had just done. The Carthan's destruction would rock the galaxy, showing that mankind now had weapons that could dictate space-time from an entire star system. The other animals would start surrendering to humans, or start devising their own countermeasures at the time. "Sir, we're getting a priority message from Earth Command," Reed said. "Admiral Chen actually wants to see you in person." Cross wasn't surprised. Sarah Chen, the scientist who had written the theoretical principles behind stellar manipulation, had been promoted to admiral after successfully testing Project Heliosphere. And now she was in charge of all strategic applications of the technology, no small burden. "Put her through," Cross said. Admiral Chen's stern visage appeared on the main screen, her careworn face revealing the weight of her command. Now she had spent a lifetime studying stellar physics, and had never thought her research would result in weapons so ruinous. "Nathaniel, I have listened to the operation," she said. "The flare was at least 12% more intense than we estimated. We have to talk about the safety, the protocol." "The generators were in an acceptable range," Cross answered. "We had some up and down, but nothing to put the mission in jeopardy." "I'm not concerned about the generators," Chen said. "It's the longer-term effects on the star itself. The effects of each manipulation are additively applied to the total stellar magnetic field. We are playing with forces we don't really understand." Cross had heard such concerns before. The moral dilemma of playing God with stars had always been a source of debate among the military brass. They were able to initiate solar flares that could wreak devastation on inhabited worlds and inflict massive civilian casualties. The same technology that had defeated Carthan could easily serve to terrorize innocent people. "What are you recommending?" he asked. "Orders to suspend indefinitely all attempts at controlling stars until the safety procedures have been studied in depth." Chen said, "We need to know exactly what we're looking at and what that implies before we do anything more." The demand left Cross no plausible option. Intel reports indicated that there were several other species in the process of developing similar technologies, a technological pissing contest that could knock the entire galaxy askew. Ultral disarmament would leave mankind open to attack by the survivors of the Carthan fleet or some other group. "Admiral, with all due respect, the Carthan threat is not done," Cross replied. "They got material force in neighboring systems still. If we let up now, they will regroup and create counterforces. And if we go on without knowing all the possible side effects, we might be doing irreversible damage to star systems throughout the galaxy." Chen shot back. "We are moving to the point where we may be affecting the habitability of planets on the scale of thousands of years." In the end, it had been a more fundamental conflict, military necessity versus scientific caution. The technology that had given humanity the single greatest strategic edge it had even possessed was the same technology that had, in one form, condemned the first people to use it 2 months confined in underground shelters with no end in sight. They had learned to trigger and bend those same forces, but at what cost? Finally, Cross replied, "I'll need orders from Fleet Command. That's above my pay grade, to be bluntly honest. I understand. But just consider what we've become, Nathaniel. We are not the species that used to hide in caves when the sun flared. Now we are the sun." Cross thought over the transmission as it faded to black. Out his view screen, Proxima Centauri still burned, the ripples from the flare he had initiated still distorting its surface. One day it would return to brightness, likely just in time to cast a dark shadow across the Confederation's morale. The human-enforced emotionalism would fade, but the scars of the magnetic field would remain for decades in its permanent magnetosphere. Hayes stepped up to his station. "Sir, I studied the stellar magentacies that we generated. There are some odd readings from the field matrix that are asymmetrical to our projections." "What odd readings?" "The magenta field lines are not returning to their standard positions. It's as if the central pole of the star is holding on to our retaining some part of the field structures we formed as artifice." It was something of a shock. If human artifice could be embedded into the long evolutive timeline of stars, then every subsequent trigger would add up more to the total of alterations, the amounting change required before critical failure. A star used to solar manipulation too many times would eventually result in total unraveling, doomed to catastrophic instability. "How long before we know how much everything will change?" Cross asked. "Weeks, possibly months," Hayes replied. "Understanding the long-term effects will certainly require watching the star across multiple solar cycles." Cross nodded, registering the fact that he would have to add this to his message to Fleet Command. It would be necessary to decide whether or not to keep up the star management in full knowledge, sweep the side effects, instead of looking only to short-term tactical gains. "Sir, I have an incoming transmission from the Carthan flagship," Reed reported. "They're requesting a ceasefire." The irony wasn't lost on Cross. The species that had abused the weak in civilizations past for millennia now begged humanity to spare them. The solar flare had put an end to their military expansion, but it had also shown them minimally humanity's own willingness to marshal the forces of the stars as weapons. "Put them through," Cross said. The reptilian Carthon commander on the vidscreen was tall, with scales that changed color to reflect his mood. They were a dim gray, showing fear and surrender. His race had evolved on a world with a remarkably steady sun, making them unusually sensitive to solar rays. "Human commander," began the Carthon, his voice affected with the robotic eeriness of a universal translator. "We recognize your superiority at starship warfare. Our remaining forces surrender unconditionally. Your fleet will fall back from all disputed systems," Cross answered. "If any effort is made to retaliate, another salvo of solar flares will be employed." "Understood," the Carthan commander said. "But we have to say, how many star systems can this technology be applied to?" It was a query that cut to the heart of strategic circumstance. In reality, the manipulation of stars in this fashion was only limited by the time and resources available to maneuver the gravitational generators around the selected star. The Proxima Centauri operation had taken 3 years to coordinate and was a substantial fraction of humankind's total capabilities. "Classified information," Cross answered. "But what you've got to realize is that mankind is going to fight when threatened, and they will use any means available." The Carthan officer's scales blackened once more. "We will withdraw as requested, but the other species are watching. They won't all be as adaptable as we have been." The transmission had terminated, a sudden click in Cross's ear, and he thought about what the commander said. The stellar manipulation technology had in fact proven to be a message to the galaxy, but perhaps not the one humanity intended. Instead of showing it was vulnerable, they had shown they were a species that could make the most fundamental forces of nature a weapon. "Sir, Admiral Morrison wants a status brief, post-op," Reed called out. Cross smoothed down his uniform and braced himself for the barrage of questions about the mission's success and the technology's prospects for the future. The victory of the Carthon fleet was clear enough. but the effects of long-term stellar tampering were less certain. Cross thought of the children on Mars as he made his way to the briefing room, hugging their underground shelters and desperately afraid of the solar storms raging over their heads. These children had become the architects of humankind's most formidable weapon, born of their childhood fears, weapons of war. The conversion was a fait accompli, but the bill was still being calculated. The faces of the senior officers from throughout the fleet that crowded into the briefing room reflected pride and unease. At the head of the table sat Admiral Morrison, his face inscrutable as he perused the mission profile. "Nice work, Captain Cross," Morrison started. "We took care of the Carthan fleet with minimal human cost. The strategic implications are significant." "Thank you, sir," Cross replied. "But we should talk about the long-term consequences of a manipulation of the stars. There are signs that the star's magnetic field may already have been permanently changed." Morrison nodded. "Admiral Chen has informed me of her concerns. Deciding to keep running is something that needs to be thought through." "What about the other species?" said Commander Rachel Torres, the intelligence officer in the fleet. "The Carthans were not the only ones watching this operation. We've discovered observation posts from no fewer than 6 civilizations. Then they know what we can do," Morrison answered. "It remains to be seen whether this will act as a deterrent to aggression or create incentives to countermeasures." Cross had been pondering that exact question. Manipulating a star was a tremendous weapon, but it was a double-edged sword. It was a highly resource-intensive technology that could not be easily done on the fly. Furthermore, use of astral powers as weapons could carry a moral implication that might not sit well with potential allies in the galaxy. "I suggest, sir, we devise a clear policy for the employment of stellar manipulation," Cross insisted. "We must differentiate between defensive applications and offensive warfare." "Agreed," Morrison replied, "but we need to also retain the strategic lead this technology gives us. The galaxy is not benign, nor should mankind look weak." The discussion raged on for hours, delving into technical details and also into ethical concerns. The officers in the room had cumulatively spent decades in the military, but they were dealing with technologies and tactics that had no historical analogue. When the light of stars became a weapon, the way people fight wars would never be the same again. After the briefing, Cross retreated to the observation deck to be alone to absorb. The day's events, the stars which had seemed so remote and unalterable, were now changed in his eyes, and each one was a candidate for a potential weapon, a force that human technology could subdue, strain, bring to heel. Humanity had gone from a species that cowered in fear at solar flares to one that mastered them. But the final ramifications were still being played out. The tech that had saved them from the Carthan plague had now spawned fresh problems which would shape the future of interstellar society. It was months before Cross heard about his next assignment. The Aurora 7 had changed too, with all of its gravity makers retrofitted with the new fail-safes initiated after the Vega disaster. Their crew had increased to include stellar physics and xenobiology experts, a symptom of how much were resting upon their advanced scientific capabilities. It was a new assignment from Fleet Command. Check out rumors of unauthorized star manipulation in the Tau Ceti system. Intelligence indicated that a rogue cell inside the hegemony was experimenting with a variant of stellar manipulation technology, which could put at risk the stability of one of the busiest star systems in the known universe. This will be unlike any operation we have conducted before, Cross told his senior staff as they examined the mission parameters. We don't have a legitimate government or a military force. These are extremists that care little for traditional rules of engagement. Hayes was reading the intelligence reports, appearing concerned. The hegemony tech siphons they've adapted are troubling. It looks like they are attempting to make permanent changes to stellar magnetic fields, structures. What kind of changes? Cross asked. They are trying to put the artificial magnetic field in such a configuration that this kind of artificial magnetic field would stick. Even if you take the gravitational generators away, Hayes said. So if they tap off enough energy from the natural field, maybe they can replace the natural magnetic field with an artificial one. What they're essentially trying to do is convert stars into permanent weapons that can be turned on and off remotely. The implications were terrifying. Should it ever become operational, the technology would enable any species to generate sleeper weapons across the galaxy that could be used at any time to obliterate star systems. That delicate balance of power only preserved by the arduousness of deploying the stellar manipulation technology would be shattered entirely. How many systems could be impacted? Cross asked. Potentially hundreds, Hayes replied. If they get it right, they could change every star in their operation volume. The whole galaxy might become a weapon. The 3 weeks of travel to Tau Ceti were not kind to Cross-conscience. They were en route to put a stop to a bunch who were making weapons of mass destruction, but with humanity's own stellar tampering stuff, they could be seen as hypocritical. The irony wasn't lost on him. The rationales that had driven humanity to develop stellar manipulation were being used by the radical hegemony faction. They all said they were acting defensively, but what it did was accelerate the arms race to include weapons capable of influencing whole star systems. "Sir, we're coming into the Tau Ceti system," Reed said. "Uncharacteristic activity in the vicinity of the star is being recorded by long-range sensors." Cross read through the tactical display, his eyes stopping on a few modified hegemony ships. In a complex lattice around Tau Ceti, the setup did not match any they had ever seen. The gravitational generators arranged in a three-dimensional lattice that enfolded the entire star. They're not just warping the magnetic field, Hayes noted. They are attempting to reorganize the whole stellar magnetosphere. The scale of the operation was mind-boggling. "Any populated planets in that system?" Cross asked. 3, Reed replied. Tau Ceti 4 has a population of around 2 million, made up mostly of research scientists and their families. The other 2 planets are industrial colonies with fewer inhabitants. A civilian population further complicated matters. The rogue faction would have to be stopped very cautiously in order to not down the very stellar disaster they were fighting against. "Open a calm to the hegemony ships," Cross said. "Before we act, we need to communicate." The reply was received as a massively complicated math transmission requiring minutes of work to decode. The Maquis chief, who introduced himself only as Geometric Prime, was willing to communicate, but they made it apparent they had no plans to halt their activity. "They are saying that this is something defensive, a response against what they call organic expansion," retranslated. "They suspect that carbon-based life forms are inherently insane and should be wiped out as a threat to the galaxy. Cross wasn't taken aback by the explanation. The hegemony, now a silicon-based system, had never trusted organic life, as being far too unpredictable and potentially threatening. The renegade faction seemed to be taking that philosophy to its extreme. "Tell them we are here to guarantee the safety of all people in the system," Cross said. "We're not picking a winner in a philosophical debate." The response was predictably hostile. Geometric Prime accused humanity of being the greater threat to galactic stability. citing their deployment of stars against the Carthon forces as an act of aggression. These disgruntled few declared that they had to alter Tau Ceti in order to stop humanity from turning the star into a weapon. "Sir, we're reading indications of impending stellar modifications," Hayes reported. "They are starting the last phase of their operations." Cross scanned the sensor monitors as the field of Tau Ceti started to show radical alteration. The rogue groups tampered with technology was generating field structures that weren't natural to see, possibly even changing the base properties of the star. "How long before the changes become fixed?" Cross asked. "According to the behavior we saw, about 6 hours, Hayes said. "But after that, the rises will be self-propelled and permanent." The schedule left them only a brief window in which to act. Though it was tempting to try to disrupt their operation, any such move would be incredibly risky and causing a stellar disaster that would doom the entire system. "Will we be able to extract the civilian populations?" Cross asked. "Not in 6 hours," Reed shot back. "It would take the evacuation ships at least 3 days to get to the outer planets." Cross was now in an impossible situation. If we let the rogue faction continue, they will have a weapon capable of wiping out all the star systems our allies live in. But trying to stop them could set off a cosmic catastrophe that would instantly wipe out millions of civilians. "Sir, I have a thought," Hayes said in hushed tones. "What if we don't fight the operation, but adjust it?" "Explain," Cross said. "The rogue faction seeks to build a permanent artificial magnetic field structure," said Hayes. "But what if we could change their pattern and make a field that would actually stabilize the star instead of using it as a weapon?" The proposal was audacious. Rather than stopping the stellar engineering, the plan then was to co-opt it. And instead of being a weapon turned against the rogue faction, the star would become a defensive system that would prevent further attempts to manipulate it. "Can we do so without causing a catastrophic flare?" Cross asked. "It's risky," Hayes admitted. "We would be interfering in a complex operation about which we don't know everything. But then the alternative is them creating a weapon that could threaten the whole galaxy." Cross considered the options. It was dangerous, but it could convert the rogue faction's weapon into a defense for the whole system. "Do it," he ordered. "But be ready to abort if the field interactions start to become unstable." The Aurora 7's gravity generators activated their artificial gravity wells, introducing subtle variations in the manipulation pattern of the rogue faction. The modifications were also meant to be quite subtle, in that the changes to the final configuration are achieved while leaving the overall function of LCLCI unchanged. "Field changes are actually right now underway," Hayes said. "They've not yet realized our interference. The traitors." Cross monitored the tactical, observing the two manipulation systems in action, each tugging the electromagnetic field structure in a different direction in such a way that nothing like it had ever been seen before. The pattern was complex and beautiful, created for longevity, not the potential for weapons. "All right, Geometric Prime is hailing us," Reed stated. "They've found us tampering and they demand to know why." Unsurprisingly, the rogue faction's commander was irate, shouting that humanity had once again undermined their defense. But Cross saw something fascinating in the mathematical patterns of the transmission: uncertainty. Geometric Prime had never been really clear on what humanity was hoping to achieve. "Tell them we're upgrading their design," Cross answered. "The field structure they were forming would be unstable on longer timescales. It's going to be something of ours. We'll make it a lot tougher." The reaction was skeptical, but not completely hostile. Geometric Prime was a scientist and extremist too, and the concept of technical advancement was something that appealed to their rationale. Sensibilities. They are asking for our technical specifications, retranslated. They are looking to know what we are doing to their operation. Cross made a fateful choice that would shape the future of start-changing technology. Instead of allowing this to be clouded with secrecy, he told Hayes to publish all the full technical details of their field stabilization mods. "Sir, that's classified," Hayes protested. "Not anymore," Cross replied. "If we're going to persuade them to accommodate our changes, we must show our cards. Tech-read transmission built over a few minutes." As Cross hardly dared to breathe, hoping he had made the right choice. He was not only leaking the best manipulation techniques among the stars humanity had, but he could also give the rogue faction the tools they would need to place even more dangerous weapons around. Geometric Prime's answer did surprise me. Instead of condemning the human modifications, the rebel leader started integrating them into his own camps. Something about the symmetry of the pattern seemed to appeal to their sense of silicon style. "They're agreeing to our amendments," Hayes said, in an astonished tone. "The resulting field topology is even more stable than both of our initial configurations." It was then that Cross observed how the two species cooperated to produce something neither species could have done alone. The Renegade's knowledge of permanent field manipulation and humanity's knowledge of how stars operate to create a magnetic conduit that was able to last and offer defense to the ship. "Field stabilization is green," Hayes called out. "We've closed the door of the past, and now it is no longer possible to control the magnetic field of Tau Ceti." The implications were profound. Rather than making a weapon, the combined operation had built a defense that would shield the star from any future attempts to manipulate it. The citizens in the system were now more secure than when the crisis first began. "Sir, we're getting a transmission from Geometric Prime," Reed reported. "They want a direct line to talk." The image that emerged on the main screen was also unlike any hegemony individual Cross had ever seen. Geometric Prime's crystal structure revealed patterns of light that implied complex thought. "Leader of humans, now your changes on our work made a mistake. We've even designed a more elegant field than your two efforts put together. The stability pattern will keep the star from being manipulated again," Cross said. "Your folk and the naturals of the system will be more secure, we hadn't thought." Of that, Geometric Prime conceded. We had been blinded by our focus on defensive measures to the possibility of collaborative solutions. The discussion lasted for hours, ranging from technical specs to philosophical ramifications. The rogue faction leader was starting to realize perhaps species-complete isolation was not the best avenue anymore. "What about this? We sign a formal alliance," Geometric Prime added at last. "Between the two of us, we could protect systems." In the galaxy, the offer was alluring, but Cross knew the political tangle it would cause. The rogue group was still regarded as a terrorist organization by the rightful hegemony government, and there would be diplomatic fallout from supporting them in any way. "I'm going to have to talk to my bosses about that," Cross said, "but I think there's room to work together." The transmission concluded with a pledge by both sides to continue the protective field around Tau Ceti while discussing potential future cooperation. The crisis had passed, but it had also revealed new opportunities for interstellar cooperation. The long trip back to human space sent Cross spiraling with ideas of what they had just done. The Tau Ceti operation had accomplished the proof that star manipulant techniques could be employed for defensive as well as aggressive purposes. The destructive forces that we had harnessed as weapons could also be used to build defensive systems that would be for the good of all mankind. The report he wrote to Fleet Command was detailed, addressing every element of the operation and its implications for policy in the future. The precedent of cooperation from the rogue hegemony faction had helped to establish that Imperials and Protestants could work together on Stellar RS. Admiral Chen met him on Earth, her face a mix of pride and worry. Operation Tau Ceti was complete, and a success as well, yet it had also prompted further questions in the future use of such stellar manipulation. "You have opened a door that we can't shut," she told her. "What specks of geometric prime that you just showed them are now in the hands of a faction we don't know or trust, but they are also in the hands of a faction that has an interest in stability now, not destruction," Cross responded. "The shield around Tau Ceti shows that it's entirely possible to use the technology for defense. And what if there are species that then request the same protection?" Chen asked. "We don't have the means to put these protective fields around every star in the galaxy." It was a valid concern. Inevitably, if the Tau Ceti mission was a success, other star systems would soon be requesting protection. Military applications of technology were now suddenly considered an essential part of civilian defense. "And maybe it's not our job," Cross said. "Perhaps it's time such technology is used more widely, in a regulated way." The idea was controversial, but it also reflected a growing consensus among military leaders. The spread of Stargate and FTL travel technology was inevitable, and our best option moving forward might be to foster that spread rather than attempt to deny it. President Harrison's reaction to the Tau Ceti operation was guardedly sanguine. The fruitful collaboration with the renegade hegemony faction had proved that even the most extreme factions were worth talking with. "This could be the dawn of an entirely new era in interstellar diplomacy," said she during a senior staff briefing. "We have the potential of working together to develop defensive systems, instead of competing against each other to produce systems which would be so deadly for the future." There was optimism for most, but Cross was guarded. It was heartening to have the ability to transform stellar manipulation from weapon into protector, but it did not resolve its underlying hazards. A technique that enabled the controlling of stellar powers would always have its dangers of apocalyptic accidents in the coming months. Cross reported to his new job, Director of International Stellar Manipulation Safety Measures, with his experience in using it for both offensive and defensive purposes. He was particularly suited to contribute to establish best practices in its safe use. The task was daunting, forcing him to weigh against one another the interests of many species and the increasing technical complications of manipulating stars. The different species had each developed their own take on the technology, and getting them all to agree to common safety standards was a diplomatic nightmare, but progress was being made. The shield around Tau Ceti had been so successful that several other star systems had been interested in obtaining similar protection, and they, the traitorous hegemony faction calling itself the Stability Collective, had become a leading proponent of defensive uses of star wrangling tech. "We have contacted 17 star systems," Hayes reported during one of their scheduled briefings. "Everybody is asking for protective fields to be established around their stars." Cross glanced at the list. There were systems there they shared with species they had once warred with. The idea of stellar manipulation warfare had apparently persuaded even age-old foes to approach each other for mutual defense. Subhead Greater than do we have the resources to fulfill all these requests? He asked. Not with today's technology, Hayes answered. But Geometric Prime has a new approach in mind. The idea isn't to put a shield in place around each individual star, they argue, but to create a web of linked fields that could offer protection to the galaxy as a whole. The proposal was more ambitious than anything that had ever been proposed. There would have to be a cohesive intergalactic network of nurturing field stars, with unprecedented interspecies cooperation and resources thrown into the effort. What are the benefits of such a network? Cross asked. You will require one to defeat modular manipulation warfare. Full galactic left vectors, said Hayes. None of the stars in the galaxy could be weaponized if they operated the network correctly. It would pretty much rule out Starside by military activity. The implications were staggering. That network would deprive the galaxy of rival powers holding stars gunsto each other's heads. In its stead, it would form a civilization that works together as it continues to protect itself. But the obstacles were just as great. Indeed, the network would need to be supported by all the great powers in the galaxy, stripping resources from all of them and constraining their militaries. That's not even counting the years it would take to negotiate politically, sirs. There's a priority message coming in from the Stability Collective, Reed said. Geometric Prime would like to conversation network proposal. What followed was among the most important conversations of Cross's career. Geometric Prime described an entire galactic stellar defense project, with nitty-gritty technical details and resource costs. It would have around 50,000 protective fields, cross-linked together, Geometric Prime clarified. A local coalition planting type would look after the crops in each of those fields, Pavone said, with support from the Stability Collective. And how do we know the network won't then become a weapon itself? Cross asked. The field configurations are so obviously defensive, Geometric Prime answered. The mathematical architectures for the defense are not usable offensively. You cannot weaponize a star if it is guarded by the web. The tech talk was persuasive, but Cross knew that the political hurdles would be steeper than the engineering ones. Getting all the major galactic powers to sign up would be an unprecedented feat of diplomacy. We're going to have to take this discussion to the Galactic Council, Cross said, but I think it has potential. The nearest thing the book had was the Galactic Council, which was a very loose alliance of multiple species formed to deal with collective threats and opportunities. It had no authority, but it organized a place for diplomatic contacts between species that would otherwise never meet. Most council members were skeptical of the Star Protection Network proposal. Those species which had dedicated a great deal of resources to star-altering weapons did not want to discard their advantages, and those who had felt threatened by the same weapons were leery of any suggestion that came from humanity and the hegemony. You're expecting us to believe that this network is only for defensive purposes, senators, remarked the Aquatic Federation representative. But technology that makes protection also makes weapons, and that's a potential moral hazard. That should make us uneasy. The math structures really are different, Cross said. The field deployments for protection are inconsistent with those for weaponization. The bickering waged for days, and each species raising concerns about how the proposed network will affect environment. The bottom line was trust. No species was going to disarm unless it was sure that others would as well. But sympathy for the network slowly began to build. The tiniest species were among the first to become interested, the ones who had so feared stellar manipulation warfare the most. Their backing also led some of the bigger players to change their minds, And then the collective, the hive mind that was the criminal species in the Vega incident, released a statement that they were behind the network. Their support was heavy with other species, and it helped push the proposal over the edge. We have seen what happens with unfettered stellar tampering, the collective delegate said. The network has the potential to help stop these disasters in the future. The final vote was closer than what Cross would have liked to have seen, but the network proposal passed. The execution would be measured in decades. But the galaxy had taken the first step towards a comprehensive defense against stellar manipulation, warfare. The subsequent years also witnessed the most cooperative atmosphere between species, yet, as the web became more established, the technical challenges were staggering, but they were surmounted by collaboration and assistance. Cross had placed himself in the middle of the implementation process, managing cross-species cooperation and supervising the placement of protective fields around important star systems. Work was hard, but knowing so many former adversaries have been working towards the same goal has been rather satisfying. It was a slow but dramatic makeover of the galaxy. The smell of stellar manipulation was being replaced with a feeling of safety as began transforming themselves into more peaceful races. Trade was blooming, scientific cooperation was thriving, and diplomatic ties were made stronger throughout the stars. But along with it came new headaches. 50,000 barrier wards were a substantial investment by themselves, and they required great care and attention. The alliance of species that had consented to back the network sometimes found it difficult to meet the financial and technical requirements of their pledges. The network's a victim of its own success, Hayes said during one of their frequent briefings. Everyone wants security, but everyone isn't willing to pay for it. The issue was especially severe in the galaxy's outlying arms, where smaller-sized races were either poor, struggling with few resources, but who also had greedy and belligerent neighbors. The network was starting to establish a two-tier system of security that could end up destroying the peace it was designed to protect. We will have to connect the bigger dots of the network without bankrupting the smaller species, Cross added. Perhaps it is time to think about alternative ways of funding it. The answer lay in a surprise find of exotic matter reserves in a number of lifeless star systems. This exotic matter, with its peculiar properties and usefulness in star-manipulating technology, became yet another form of capital with which to finance further network expansion. The anomalies of exotic matter reserves are enough to extend the network for at least 100 years, Geometric Prime said. We hypothesize a mutual fund from which everyone pays as much as they can. Smaller species eagerly embraced the proposal as it gave them the ability to fully participate in the network without ruining themselves. The bigger species were a little suspicious at first, but they finally figured out that it was in everyone's best interest to protect every single life. The growth of the network took off lightning fast after the monetary concerns were addressed. New defense fields have popped up at a never-before-seen pace, and the galaxy is starting to look more like a massive defensive barricade than an area where many powers are struggling over the dominance. But the biggest shifts were psychological. They were a species that had long lived in fear of stellar manipulation, warfare, but they now dreamt of cooperation and peace. The kids who were raised under the shield of the network had no memory of the fear which had been the impetus for its formation. Cross, now in his 70s, was pondering the change he staggered out of bed with. The very species that had once cowered in underground bunkers, impotent before solar storms, were now the defenders of the galaxy against the ravages of stellar nightmares. We have gone farther and come back to the same spot, he told Hayes, who had stuck with him at every stage of the decades of network building. We began as victims of cosmic forces, then learned to manipulate them, and now we have become their protectors. It's been an incredible ride, Hayes affirmed. But I think we've learned something crucial about the nature of power. What's that? Cross asked. Real power isn't the ability to blow up your enemies, Hayes answered. It is the power of protecting your friends. What the observation caught was something essential about humanity's dance with stellar engineering. Those same powers that had once been weapons had become instruments of protection and collaboration. The web continued to grow until it reached to encompass every inhabited star system in the galaxy. The specter of star warp warfare became a historical relic, relegated to histories of military science and the memoirs of those who lived through the passage. But its success introduced new obstacles the right generation had never experienced. A disaster of the stars. I sometimes felt like the Death Stars were a costly form of insurance. They don't know what we went through, Cross said to President Harrison during one of their briefings. They view the network as an expense they could do without, rather than a critical defense. That's what you have to do to be successful, Harrison answered. Every generation has to rediscover the lessons that were known by the previous generation, or you're going to repeat their mistakes. The challenge was especially urgent as Cross and the rest of his age group began retiring. The institutional memory of the battles over stellar manipulation was fading, and the younger leadership often lacked the perspective to appreciate the network's value. But there were hopeful signs too. The symbiosis that had developed during the network's construction had formed interspecies lifetime bonds. The children to whom the network had provided safe passage were more inclined to view other species as partners rather than threats. We've achieved something incredible, Cross said during his final briefing as coordinator of the Stellar Protection Network. We have taken the galaxy from a place of endless war to a place of peaceful collaboration, and we've done it by mastering control of our greatest fear, Hayes said. The very stars that posed to destroy us have now become our rocks and our shields. The metamorphosis was finished, but there was still an end to write before the tale was done. The network would need regular upkeep and the occasional upgrade as new scams presented themselves. V cooperation among species that had enabled it would have to be fostered and maintained for future generations. But the groundwork had been laid. The galaxy was no longer to be a domain where stellar power could be harnessed for WMDs. The appointments with disaster had been supplanted by appointments with hope, and the children who had grown up under the shelter of the network would inherit a universe infinitely less dangerous than the one that had taught their parents to kill. Cross had retreated to a small colony on the far side of the inhabited galaxies, where he could watch the stars without worry. The very same heavenly bodies that have brought terror once and violence another day were now merely exquisite pinpoints of light in the darkness, defended by the network that had remade the galaxy. The final lines of his memoir summed up the progress of humanity from his own days as a victim to a survivor to a protector. We learned to dance with the stars instead of scurrying from them. When we did, we found that the greatest power is not the power to destroy, but the wisdom to save. The appointments we made with disaster became appointments with hope, and the galaxy is better for it. The Stellar Defense Network had been humanity's greatest accomplishment, a demonstration of the power of cooperation and the wisdom of transforming weapons into shields. The next generation, who had cowered in underground shelters from solar storms, had built a galaxy where no child would ever be afraid of the sky. Managed them had taken hundreds of years, But the last step had occurred very fast. The scientific inquiry that led them to reach out into the stars also drove them to tame the forces that directed the universe. Hayes came to stand beside him, her eyes thoughtful. "Do you think we did the right thing, sir?" It was a question, without an easy answer. The destruction of the Carthan fleet had clearly saved human lives and human worlds from aggressive expansion. The methods that enabled this social victory, however, had transcended lines of moral rectitude that generations past would have regarded as unimaginable. Cross said, "I think we've done what was required. Time will tell if it was right or wrong. My grandma would tell me stories of the old solar storms," Hayes said. "She experienced some of the worst, such as having to evacuate entire cities to subterranean shelters. It was some kind of red," she said, "and a woman telling me that the sky was on fire." Cross nodded. "My parents had the same thing. They never forgot the terror of helplessness in the face of forces beyond their control. And now we have the power of those forces," Hayes noted. "We've made our worst fear our absolute weapon." The observation was true enough, but not sufficiently nuanced. Humanity had mastered the power of the stars, but it was a skill that sworn them to terrifying obligations. Every instance of star manipulation was essentially a justified calamity, pinpointed but remaining subject to collateral damage. "Captain, new priority transmission from Earth," Reed called over the com. "President Harrison wishes to address the fleet." Cross and Hayes headed for Central Com, where the entire crew had assembled to listen to the president's announcement. The image that flashed up on the main screen was of a woman in her 50s, her countenance etched with the strain of leadership in one of humanity's hardest, most demanding moments. "Officers and men of Stellar Fleet," President Harrison began, "today you have won a victory that will rank high in the annals of man. The Carthon Navy has been defeated, and this shows that humanity will not cower from weight of numbers or against superior technology." The crew stood listening in reverent silence as, "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost," the President interpreted to them the strategic meaning of the victory. The Carthons were one of the most aggressive expansionist forces in the galaxy, and with their fall, other races would be eager to take their place. But we must not lose sight of the responsibilities that come with our new advantages. The technology that delivered us this victory must be employed wisely and with circumspection. We're not a conqueror spreading across the galaxy. We're citizens asserting our right to live in the stars. The statement was unmistakably issued to draw to the attention the moral considerations of playing with stars. In describing the technology as a shield and not a sword, the President was trying to hold higher the moral ground of humanity, while securing humanity's place on top. "The Carthon surrender is only the first," Harrison went on. "We are in a situation where we are noticing attacks from various sides, and we have to be very well armed. But remember, at the same time, that our end goal is not war, but peace alongside other species." As the President's word came to a close, Cross pondered the precarious course mankind was on. Stellar manipulation technology had put control of their surroundings in their hands as never before, and with that power had come new duties, and also new issues of conscience. The potential of effectively using such weapons would have to be considered in the context of the immense future costs. "Sir, Admiral Chen would like another conference," Reed said. "There are new things in the stellar analysis." "She says." Cross hurried to the SCIF, and Admiral Chen filled his high-resolution screen. She looked more worried than she had before, and that didn't bode well for the stakes of what had transpired. "Nathaniel, We have results from our initial analysis of the stellar manipulation effects, she started. The findings are even scarier than we initially thought. What did you find? Cross asked. The changes in the magnetic field are being transmitted through the core of the star, Chen said. We're observing variations in the nuclear fusion rate in ways that we don't understand that could have far-reaching consequences for the wonky stability of the star. If the trend continues, substantial differences in Proxima Centauri's emitted light might be only decades away. The implications were staggering. If power over stars altered what the basic properties of a star were forever, surely whatever technology used, it did so in the knowledge that the habitability of entire star systems was up for grabs every time it was used. Here was a weapon that had given humans their biggest victory, the nuclear weapons that ended World War II. But it might also be making long-term environmental disasters, he said. How confident are you in these estimates? Cross asked. The data is early, but the trends are, Chen said. Cease all star mod activity until we can complete a full investigation. Cross understood the scientific logic of the recommendation, but also the military reality. The galaxy was not now going to be peaceful just because humanity had gotten squeamish about its weapons. Many other species must be also working on the same technology, and we would be defenseless if we were to unilaterally disarm. I will carry your concerns to Admiral Morrison, Cross said. But the ultimate decision to cease operations is going to have to come from the very top of command. I understand, Chen replied, but there's also the potential that we've built a weapon we can't afford to use. We may not be able to safely control the ability to harness the forces of the stars. The discussion resolved with as many questions as answers. Cross was facing a fundamental dilemma with no easy answer. The very technology that had saved humanity from the Carthan threat might be creating new threats that would harm the future generations of man. In the ensuing days, the dispute over manipulation of stars roiled through the upper echelons of the military. Scientists offered data on possible long-term risks. Military strategists urged the need to keep a technological edge. The talks were further complicated by intelligence reports that several other species were themselves stepping up work on similar technologies as the Carthan withdrew in accordance with the treaty. This left a power vacuum, and other species, notably the Yamatayans, rushed in to fill the gap. Nevertheless, the hegemony, a coalition of silicon-based creatures, started to move into former Carthan lands. And the collective, the hive mind species there used quantum entanglement to communicate, had increased activity in the quadrant. Reports are coming in of unusual stellar phenomena in the Vega system, Hayes announced during one of their routine briefing sessions. The patterns do not correspond to any known natural effects. Cross analyzed the data, paying attention to the exactly when the reported flares occurred and how intense they were. The attributes resembled the galaxy the humans had created, but it was beyond the reach of humanity's gravity. Could this be natural? He asked. Unlikely, Hayes replied. The patterns of magnetic fields are too organized, too regulated. Another party is drawing upon forces of the stars. The implications were disturbing. If other races them had somehow ever formulated their own varieties of stellar manipular technology, the balance of powers that lay so neatly on humanity's side would balance the scales in a hurry. Even worse, the development of such weapons could trigger an arms race that would render the galaxy far more dangerous. Alert, Admiral Morrison, Cross ordered. We had better look into this at once. Cross sat back, while the Aurora 7 was being overhauled for departure for the Vega system, looking at the current interstellar climate, which had developed faster than wet concrete in a matter of months. The human race had gone from a not particularly significant competitor on the stage of galactic politics to possessing a weapon which could, of its own force, unite something as large as an entire star system. Their head start, however, was being eroded by other species who were emerging capable of the same. Even with the best propulsion systems the fleet possessed, the trip to Vega would last weeks. It was during this time that Cross realized he was researching the historical archive of humanity's interaction with solar activity. The transition from passive victims of celestial violence to human agents navigating the stellar machinery had been slow and steady. But the shift from formative technologies to weaponized resources had occurred with breathtaking speed. The original human space settlements had been built on the assumption that solar flares were unpredictable natural disasters. There were cities underground, communication systems engineered to resist interference from electromagnetic pulses, entire populations with a way of life built around perpetual fear of radiation. The psychological consequences of those early experiences had forged human culture in ways that were still being realized. Since the advent of Comicat control of faring, this no longer had been the case. Humanity had gone from a race that feared the sky to one that had its will in the heavens. Those children who used to be crammed into basement bunkers during solar storms were now old enough to be the architects of weapons that could induce these storms at will. But the evolution wasn't free. That technology which gave humanity its greatest military edge come with equally new ethical dilemmas and potential ecological disaster. The ability to control stars may simply be power that is too dangerous for any species to possess. As the Aurora 7 neared the Vega system, the long-range sensors picked up the signature of several alien craft in formation around the star. It was uncannily similar in design to the gravity generator array that had been used by humanity at Proxima, but, like the ship, the tech seemed to be of alien origin. Recognizing the Xenobots, said Hayes, they look like Hegemony made, but with heavy alteration. They're definitely attempting stellar manipulation. Cross studied the tactical readout, taking in the exact placement of the alien devices near Vega. It seemed as if the Hegemony had created their own manner of manipulating stars, based upon a different technology, but one capable of doing the same things. Are they targeting anything specific? He asked. Unclear, Hayes replied. But there are multiple inhabited worlds in this system, and a significant collective research facility. If one of those sets off a big flare, the fatalities could be catastrophic. What he described was exactly the sort of event that Admiral Chen had been warning against. There were too many machines which could make stars flare up all over the place, and accidents, let alone outright raids on civilian populations, were becoming all too frequent. Military weapons were being deployed with no compromise on the moral standpoint. Get the Hegemony ships on the horn, Cross instructed. We have to let everyone know before they touch off something they can't control. The answer came promptly, in the shape of a message written entirely in mathematical calculations and astronomical metrics. Being silicon-based life forms, the Hegemony would communicate through rigid, logical constructs rather than the emotional or intuitive paths followed by organic life. What they are saying is that it is a defensive action. Read translated. They claim the collective's research is destabilizing the system. Cross wasn't surprised. The very same reasons that mankind had used to fudge humanity's stellar engine programs were being used by some of the other species. All sides, said they, were acting in self-defense. But the end result was an increasing use of weapons that could disturb entire star systems. We are a third party here to observe. Cross said. We responded. We don't take sides, but we're worried about the safety of all the inhabited worlds in the system. The hegemony acted, as might be expected, with a sound, sane logic. They also did the math to show that their proposed stellar manipulation would be exact and would not impact the habitable worlds. But Cross had seen such calculations before, and he knew that stellar forces were by nature hard to predict and hard to control. Sir, we are sensing signs of an imminent flare. Get external value greater than NAG, J.C. Heinemann, J.G. et al., cerebral oxygenation. During external counterpulsation, the hegemony devices are wreaking havoc in the star's magnetic field. Cross monitored the sensor boards as it appeared that Vega's surface was getting active. The patterns were familiar, but they weren't exactly the same as those they had identified on Proxima Centauri. There were some subtle differences in how the alien tech was behaving. The magnetic field lines were being modified in a manner that seemed fundamentally different than how we were used to controlling stellar behavior. Flare launch in 7 minutes, Hayes said. Fucking hell, is heading straight towards the collective research station, wherever the hell he's hiding. The implications were clear. The hegemony was turning stellar manipulation into a weapon upon the collective, maybe even killing thousands of researchers and nullifying decades of scientific endeavor. Defensive technology was being leveraged for what effectively amounted to genocide. Is there a way we could block their manipulation of it? Cross asked. Possibly, Hayes replied. If we rig our gravity generators to produce counter-resonance fields, then perhaps we can interfere with their controlled temper. It was a risky proposal. Messing with star manipulation of another species could lead to unintended results, and they may create a flare, much more powerful than anyone wants. But if they allowed the hegemony to launch their attack unopposed, it would set a precedent that would unbalance the galaxy. Do it, Cross ordered. But have your finger on the abort if the resonance fields go unstable. The gravity generators of the Aurora 7 rumbled to life and created artificial patches of gravity wells that created ripples in space-time, propagating across the distance to Vega. Interference interaction between the human and hegemony manipulation systems tended to generate complex patterns which were unpredictable and hard to control. Subtopol's fields are engaging, Hayes said. The hegemony tampering is disintegrating, but the star's magnetic field is growing more volatile. Cross observed the tactical display as the crap hit the fan. The interaction of the two different systems was producing feedback loops that amplified the natural gyrations of the star. Far from preventing the flare, their intervention might be making it even more dangerous. Abort the counter-resonance, Cross ordered. We're making the situation worse. Too late, Hayes replied. The feedback loops are now self-reinforcing. The star is going to flare no matter what we do. The solar flare that emitted from Vega was the likes of which Cross had never been privy to. The incompatibility between human and hegemony control systems had resulted in a chaotic magnetic field configuration through which the plasma was directed in random directions received it, instead of their target, a collective research station. The flare fragmented into many streams as it hit several different locations in the system. Impact assessment, Cross demanded. It was a glancing blow to the collective station, Hayes said. Serious damage, but they are emitting survival signals. The primary flare struck an uninhabited moon, however. Secondary effects have resulted in traffic abnormality through the entire system. It was the doomsday scenario that Admiral Chen had dreaded. The spread of star manipulation technology was scaling up the potential mistakes that could wipe out an entire star system. The weapons they had designed well for specific military use. Cases were proving to be inherently dangerous when being used simultaneously across systems. We're getting messages in from both the hegemony and the collective, Sir Reed reported. Each side wants to know why we are involved. Cross had the unenviable task of trying to justify the actions of humanity to two species that were potential enemies. The intervention was supposed to stop a genocidal assault. The outcomes generated new problems of possibly worse order than the threat. Tell them we're ready with humanitarian aid, Cross responded. The system's safety is first and foremost all of the people who live there. The reaction of both species was an entirely predictable antipathy. The hegemony blamed mankind for willfully interfering with their defensive measures, the collective for the destruction of their research station. Neither side was ready to admit the interference had likely been meant to avert a greater disaster. During the Aurora 7's efforts to aid the crippled collective station, Cross considered what he had learned from the Vega encounter. With the emergence of star manipulative technology, war was full of new possibilities and prospects, and so were the risks and misunderstandings. No sooner had the weapons that had produced humanity's greatest triumph become, in part, responsible for creating new dangers that seemed beyond control. The ride back to human dispute space lasted for weeks, and Cross managed to produce long reports about all that had happened at Vega. The conclusion was obvious. The spread of stellar manipulation technology gave birth to a new kind of Cold War, one that might tear the fabric of the whole galaxy apart. The defensive arms developed by one species were used as an offensive arm of another. When Crossover regained consciousness and returned to Earth, he was called into a series of high-level briefings with military and government officials. That humans had already been losing the strategic advantage other races had in stellar manipulation based on the Vega incident, and that it was an inevitable paradox to begin with when two systems came close. The situation has reached a point of unsustainability, Admiral Chen said during one of the briefings. We had at least 6 species developing stellar maniptech, and none of them were even talking about it with each other. There is an incredibly high risk of catastrophic accidents. President Harrison nodded grimly. What are you recommending? International cooperation, Chen replied. Stellar manipulation technology needs to be regulated, or at least used in a responsible manner. In the same way, there are nuclear non-proliferation treaties today. The suggestion was rational, but Cross recognized the political complications. The little bit of stargazer life that were developing star-tampering technology fought against each other as much as everyone else, and would not have agreed to limiting their martial power anyway. The hegemony and the collective still point the finger at us for the Vega encounter, Cross reminded. They're not going to entertain offers of cooperation from humanity. Then we'd better come up with a way to show how unregulated manipulation of stars is dangerous, Chen responded. The Vega incident was only the first. If we don't set safety protocols, we're going to wind up with a much more serious accident. The debate lasted for hours, spanning from technical specifications to diplomatic tactics. They agreed humanity should be taking the lead on ground rules for stars, but no one could figure out how this was going to be done. As Cross got ready to head back to his ship, he couldn't help but think about the young'uns that would grow up in a galaxy full of star manipulation. They would endure perils none of their earlier generation could have even known of, live in a cosmos where the very stars could be spun into weaponry, from a species that used to live in fear of solar flares.